In Jan's elegant and well-argued paper, she provided a mosaic of theoretical ideas which can be used to understand the mindless body in action. She's worked from clinical experience to a search for illumination from theory, and then played with the two to produce her own unique synthesis. My contribution is, I think, more phenomenological than hers, and I'm presenting you with a challenge to construct your own theories about what I will present. I first became interested in the notion of personalization, although of course I didn't call it that at the time, just after I'd left school, when with a few months to spare, I was invited by some old family friends who ran a Rudolf Steiner home for mentally and physically handicapped children to come and help out in a voluntary capacity. The man who ran it was an exceptional person, an internationally renowned colour scientist, ex-leader of the Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, a reputable alpine climber, and a scholar of anthroposophy. He had designed and introduced two quite remarkable innovations into the treatment of the children in his care. The first consisted of a swimming pool in a room, the walls and ceilings of which were painted black. There were no windows. Around the walls of the pool, at regular intervals and a very specific distance below the surface of the water, he had installed lights which refracted in such a way that the only thing visible when one was in the water was one's own body. Treatment consisted of a child and its key worker spending time together in the water, the child often being held by the worker and talked to about its body. The effect was somewhat remarkable because children prone to uncontrollable movements and gross lack of coordination gradually relaxed and over time became more coordinated and developed a more intact body scheme, as evidenced by their drawings. The second innovation was also remarkable. The same type of child was taken into the colour room, where he or she would sit next to their therapist, who would project various sequences of colours and patterns of colours from two synchronized projectors onto a screen, until a point at which the child became relatively still in the bodily sense, and engaged with the process sometimes to the point of being spellbound, as if seeing a psychosomatic unity in projection, a sort of picture of the self. This inner and outer stillness could be shattered by the therapist, introducing alien colours or shapes, which led to agitation, but the damage could also be repaired. In both processes, the child was held and seemed to arrive at a state which Winnicott has called personalization, psychosomatic collusion, or the psyche indwelling in the soma. Winnicott sees this as an achievement of the mother-infant duo because he works from the premise that the infant is originally in an unintegrated state. This is different from Fordham's model, to which I will return later. I'd like to continue by inviting you to reflect privately within yourselves on a process that may have occurred within you in the time leading up to this conference, on arrival at the conference, and during the day so far. Although I present the process in a linear way, I do not wish to imply that it happens in that manner. I suggest rather that all of us have moved from left to right and right to left across a spectrum, shifting perhaps imperceptibly at times and moving across vast tracts of psychic space at other times. The journey sometimes requiring vast effort and at other times experienced in Doctor Who-like manner, instant, effortless transportation. Although I may appear to be keeping you in suspense for a little while, this spectrum may become apparent to you, I hope, from the intonation in my voice while I read the following sentences. The clue is in the intonation of the first word, and most particularly in the rhythm with which it is enunciated. Everybody, at that conference will have something more interesting to say than me. A body preceded me slowly up the stairs. I realized it was myself. Anybody who so wishes can interrupt me at any time. Somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I turned round and there was Joe Bloggs, whom I hadn't seen since the last SAP conference. Would you agree, and of course you may not, that in the intonation and rhythm of somebody there is a relaxation of a split between the prefix and the noun body? In moments of anxiety, however, the split is re-established. For example, somebody was lurking down the alley at the side of the house. In other words, somebody who was not myself. Or the split is even more telescoped than usual. Somebody shouted, "Fire, fire!" The somebody could be myself because there was psychic contagion and a blurring of boundaries, and I was feeling much the same as he or she was. So to return to the spectrum, it runs from everybody to a body to anybody to somebody. To that horizontal spectrum we can add a vertical dimension of depth consisting of variations on the personal, so that behind everybody there is the transpersonal, behind a body there is the depersonal, behind anybody there is the impersonal, and behind somebody is the personal. To return here again and play with these dimensions, my experience of you as a group might roam pretty frantically across the spectrum. At anxious moments, I might alight on the ceiling and watch myself talking to you. I would become a body, in other words, I would become depersonalized. I might get a feeling of connectedness with you all, in which case I might feel myself to be in some sort of transpersonal realm and have a feeling of being part of everybody. I might recognize somebody that I know and feel relief, in which case I'm in a personal realm. Or I might feel that anybody who gives up a Saturday to come to the SAP can be sure at least of a good lunch, in which case I'm being pretty impersonal, and perhaps that's a constituent of cynicism. Similarly, in the course of the day, you may find yourselves having feelings, for instance, about me, ranging from he's everybody, in the sense of being a representative of the SAP, to he is somebody, in the sense that you get some sort of feeling for the sort of person that I am. All of what I'm saying could be applied to us all in our various roles, and it's conceivable that after today we could look back and plot ourselves along the spectrum and in depth, and discover ourselves at different places during the course of the day. So far the scheme is quite neat, though questionable. We could even liken it to Jung's analogy of the archetype with the rainbow, so that the personal would be at the infrared end of the spectrum, the instinctual, and the transpersonal would be at the ultraviolet, the archetypal image. But as I wrote this paper on my word processor, the little green square of the cursor flashed out its blank message to me relentlessly. What about nobody? If we care to adhere to Jung's notion of the conflict of opposites and their transcendence, the depth dimension of nobody that subsumes and shadows all the horizontal dimensions of body and the vertical dimensions of personal plunge us into a three-dimensional model in which the meaning of nobody varies enormously depending on the dimension to which we are opposing it. Nobody has the dual meaning on the one hand of no person and on the other of no body. So in looking for the opposites of somebody, anybody, a body, everybody, it seems clear to me that the meaning of nobody, in antithesis to any of these, is markedly different, and in certain kinds of patients can get muddled up. For example, the feeling, I am out of my body, in other words, there is nobody in that body, may act as a defensive structure against the feeling, I miss somebody. In other words, there is nobody there outside my body. In other words, depersonalization may act as a defense against the lack or loss of personalization and relatedness. My question in this paper is, what was the anxiety in the patient I will present that made it impossible for him to sustain personalization, a state in which a person feels that his psyche dwells within his body, so that he is somebody and can relate to somebody else. I would interpolate here that the word body is derived from an old High German word meaning tub, vat or cask. In other words, a container. And apart from blood, water, bone, muscle and a host of other things and organs, the body contains, or hopefully contains, the psyche. I wish to define my terms a little more exactly. To begin with the transpersonal, this is the medium by which we know about humanity. It derives from the collective unconscious and is expressed in universal imagery, which is itself informed by contemporary culture. The image from this realm upon which I will be drawing in relation to the patient I wish to describe is that of the vampire. Secondly, the depersonal. Depersonalization can be defined in Jungian terms as a state of dissociation between psyche and soma, or between psyche and a part of the soma, or between the functions. In the first instance, I am thinking of a man who during the early weeks of his life had been offered for adoption by his teenage mother. He spent the next 3 years in a children's home, where one day he was riding around on a tricycle and crashed into a tree. He recalled that he was not badly hurt, but he looked at his knee and saw that it was bleeding. Gradually a numbness radiated out from his knee and permeated his entire body, and he flew up into the tree and observed himself from there, so to speak, anaesthetized. Later, in his early 20s, this mechanism came into play when he was training in Arctic conditions with the army. His training partner collapsed, but he was able to carry him 14 miles to the nearest help, defying the elements and hovering above his burdened self as he plodded on through the blizzard. Another patient in a temporary psychotic state would take off her head, place it between her knees and slap it from side to side repeatedly, while staring ahead with an expressionless face. During a while in the transference, she became very anxious about putting a foot wrong, stepping out of order, or not towing the line. These are the patient's phrases, not mine, and indicate an anxiety about walking out of her body. It's interesting to note here that in my experience, people who tend towards depersonalization also have a hypochondriacal pocket, an intense fascination with a particular limb, organ, or location in the body. An increase in fascination with the diseased part often precedes states of depersonalization. If there's validity in this observation, then I would suggest that depersonalization is purposive, in the sense that the psyche-soma tries to hang on to or restore a sense of integrity by the ego dissociating itself from and taking a coldly detached, hostile attitude towards the part of the body ego that is felt to be ill or damaged. To put it another way, a part of the body ego plays at being dead, like an animal in the process of submission to a more powerful foe in order to avoid further damage. Thirdly, there is the realm of the impersonal, where there is no reference to any individual, and human warmth, sympathy and empathy are lacking. And fourthly, there is the personal, in which psyche and soma are in collusion, enabling the person to relate in himself and others in an ordinary human way. The word collusion has become pejorative in our profession, and in fact it means playing together. patient I wish to present today is in contrast to Jan's patient, insofar as his mindless body tended to go into action outside the consulting room. Reverting to the spectrum, we could say in an essential way that he was possessed by what I came to think of as his vampire complex, which included both the wish to suck the lifeblood out of his victim and a terror that others would do the same to him. That was an undercurrent. Nearer the surface, there was an unusual capacity to depersonalize himself, combined with a concomitant ruthlessness towards others, which made them all impersonal. Although personable, he was neither personal nor personalized. His introduction of my Christian name in the 5th and last year of analysis was a clue to an embryonic capacity for personalization. He was referred by a colleague in a GP practice to whom the patient related that he had consulted a psychoanalyst some years previously after he'd been beaten up by a gang of Arab men with whom he had had hopes of sexual exploits. This male analyst had focused on his self-destructiveness, which had penetrated him, but he lost his nerve and backed off. 3 factors precipitated him into resuming his search. Firstly, after 4 years, he had broken up with a stunningly beautiful Jewish art historian who could not tolerate his bisexuality. Secondly, he'd made enough money to enable him to live for 2 years without doing further work, and he could not conceive of any further purpose in his life. He was 35 when I first met him. And thirdly, he had bought a wreck of a house and could not get into it, in the sense that he could not move in, and neither could he mobilize builders to transform it under his direction. My initial impressions of him were informative. I thought to myself, here is a scarecrow who is a member of the mafia. On a personal note, I love scarecrows and seek them out in the countryside in whichever country I happen to be in. But their purpose is to ward off the projected vampire, to act as guardians to the farmer's livelihood. The mafia image, full of shadow projections on my part, was more sinister and again essentially paranoid. If I don't come up with the goods, this man is the sort that will sue. For the initial consultation, he arrived punctually, forecasting his punctiliousness about time, but surrounded by deafening rock music booming from his expensive car. At the front door I encountered a person somewhat shorter than myself, dressed in what I came to think of as a uniform. Black shoes, white socks, a variety of pullovers, extremely formal shirts, the sort that need collar studs, the same overcoat, always unbuttoned, and a woolly scarf in winter and a silk scarf in summer. On the whole, an unchanging persona, and one that was interestingly asexual. Of interest was that he did not seem to inhabit his clothes. There was an air of austerity about him, borne out by the analysis, and highlighted by a monk's tonsure, which was the only remnant of his hair that had managed to regrow after an attempt to make love with a girl called Pandora, they were both 16, which had been undermined by his impotence. He awoke the next morning with his hair shamefully lying abandoned on the pillow. So we have monk, scarecrow and mafia inhabiting the room. Quite a combination. The monkish side to him proved to be of great importance. He was deeply steeped in the Jewish mystics and a passionate devotee of Martin Buber, whom he could quote verbatim at length. He knew that what he hankered after was Buber's notion of I-thou, and that he was stuck in an I-it modality. And this grieved him, which made me think that he had lost somebody, for why else should he be in contact with this amorphous grief? He was verbally agile and interesting, and his dilemmas engaged me, although he presented them in the form of a chess puzzle. We spent an inordinate amount of time working out session times. His profession, that of managing rock groups, pop groups, apparently dictated an exciting gamble with time, in which concerts, recording sessions, trans-global travel, video engagements, press conferences, all conspired to bedevil bodily needs, to beleaguer any sense of at-homeness or homeliness, and to portray himself as someone desirable but forever unattainable. His schedule for the next year, as well as his financial innings and outings, were contained on a small machine that he kept in the inside breast pocket of his overcoat, and this seemed to embody, in a maternal sort of way, his feeding and shitting schedule. I found myself identifying with the first analyst he'd consulted, and made it very clear that I wouldn't work with him unless I saw him 3 times a week on a regular basis. And I added possessively and rather sadistically that I didn't think anyone else he might care to consult would bargain for less. "Fuck this," he said, and we parted on the understanding that he'd phone me within 7 days to say whether or not he wanted to contract with me. I was not a little surprised when he did telephone to say that he'd rescheduled everything to make the analysis possible, and that he'd done this by hiring a personal assistant, a female ex-employee of his mother, in whom he had confidence that she could manage his affairs here and abroad in his absence. His family gradually seeped into our space. He was Jewish. His father, whom he despised for his lack of healthy vampiring, insofar as every business venture he had entered had failed, had remarried an Austrian hysteric, gorged on scorn and contempt for men, and delighting, according to the patient's perception, in watching her husband's cock shrivel, and shrieking with delight at the spectacle. Once again, it was only in the last year of our work together, coinciding with the patient introducing my Christian name, that a slightly more forgiving personal relationship with his own father began to develop. The mother was and is the manageress of a famous female pop star, out of whom she's made a very great deal of money. Every week, my patient would go to his mother's for a meal, return home and be sick. Whilst on tour with her and the pop star when he was 13, he happened to witness a younger man going into his mother's hotel room and realized that his parents' marriage was over. Shortly afterwards, she ignominiously threw out her husband, and this other man moved in. As soon as he had done so, he apparently became impotent, and he too was thrown out, the facts being made known to the children. The patient, whom I shall call Brian, had an elder sister, possibly the only good person in the sense of good object in his life. He also had an identical twin who is vital to the story. The elder sister lived abroad, but maintained good phone contact with Brian. The twins met several times a week, and there was an incident in the 3rd year of analysis which created enormous anxiety in Brian. He and his mother had been interviewed by one of the tabloid press, interested in the relationship between managers and pop stars. A photograph of them, together, was to herald in the article. My patient received an emergency phone call from his twin brother to say that the photo must not go into the paper. His brother, like his father and like the paternal grandfather, were addicted to attending prostitutes, and my patient's brother had evaded payment for one of his encounters. Were whose photograph to appear in the papers, my patient's twin might be severely compromised. He, the twin, was at the time a prospective Conservative parliamentary candidate, and had informed my patient that Mrs. Thatcher had mooted a plan to depopulate the Isle of Wight and turn it into a ghetto for those suffering from AIDS. An idea my patient completely took on board, in a totally unquestioning way, reactivating some sort of gas chamber complex. But you'll see the connection to my theme. Between the twins there seems to be a question about whose body belongs to whom, or who is occupying whose body, and does either body contain a mind? A similar confusion arose in Brian's brain, not his mind, after he'd gone to a prostitute who'd declared that she would perform fellatio with him as long as he would finally ejaculate over her face. He reported that she said, "If you don't, I'll scrunch your balls into shit." Since her hand was in cupping his scrotum at the time, he formed an idea that her threat could become reality. But at the same time, he experienced an exquisite delight, to use his words, that he could become a woman and produce a baby. But when I next saw him on a Monday, he had become very confused. He had complied with her conditions, but had reversed the situation into thinking that now he must have AIDS. In other words, that she had infused him with a bodily fluid of a life-threatening nature. The way he told the story was such that I became confused myself about who had done what to whom, at the same time realizing that there was no who and there was no whom. There was only a breast delivering milk, but immediately withdrawing so that the infant was deluged in tantalizing, loveless milk. Premature ejaculation had been a major problem in his relationship with the stunningly beautiful art historian. To revert to the history, the parents apparently reached an agreement that Brian would be mainly reared by his mother and the twin by his father. In their early years, the children were minded by totally unsuitable people. One of the housekeepers turned out to be a transvestite, another was alcoholic and sacked after she had fallen downstairs whilst inebriated. As time passed, Brian found himself engulfed in the glamorous, exciting and hectic, and I think emotionally shallow world of his mother. His emotional needs were largely overshadowed by his arch-rival, the pop star, whom he both loathed and loved. At home, whilst his brother played football with his father, Brian would play with dolls, later devouring French and English literature. He did well at his bilingual school, but again tended to hang around with the girls. At puberty he became conscious of homosexual fantasies, and his fiasco with Pandora was repeated in France, where the well-tried and traditional rite de passage, or sexual initiation, for boys had succeeded only in adding to his humiliation. He left the brothel and was quickly picked up by an older man who took him home and buggered him. This was an important experience for him for two reasons. Firstly, the lower part of his body became depersonalized, and secondly, the anal penetration enabled him to sustain an erection, although he had to look to make sure it was still there. This homosexual orientation was endorsed by the father back in England, who took him to a gay sauna. He was then launched on a life of reckless promiscuity. He found a big hairy man at university whom he could climb all over, but neither that man nor any other of his many sexual partners gave him any pleasure, any sense of closeness, not even any relief. The castrating Arabs in Paris catapulted him out of the business world, in which, unlike his father, he had been successful, and back into the world of mother. He set himself up as a manager of pop groups, initially relying parasitically on his mother's contacts, but quickly becoming very successful. I want now to turn to a very specific theme in the analysis. After a few months, when some trust had been built between us, he told me of a pattern of behaviour. For no reason that he could discover, he would suddenly get an impulse to go to a cruising ground. The journey and the anticipation of the scenario generated terrific excitement, located primarily in his stomach and experienced as pleasurable butterflies. On arrival at public lavatories or large open spaces, and he preferred the latter, he would stalk another man, preferably rough trade, and preferably older. An approach would be made, but no words exchanged. Silence was an essential ingredient of the ritual. He would undress the man who had to be circumcised. If he wasn't, Brian would leave at considerable risk to himself. He would then strip, take the other man's penis in his mouth, and bring him to orgasm. During this stage, he had no body other than his mouth. He always had the impulse to close his teeth round the other man's member, and had once given in to this, only to be kicked swiftly in the balls by his partner, and abandoned writhing on the grass. He would return home feeling triumphant, but would invariably awake in the night with a pain in his stomach. This seemed on the surface like pretty classical stuff to me. I was able to link his need for me to be penetrative with his compulsive search for a strong masculine father, and this did indeed bring some relief. He experienced that line of interpretation rather like a revelation, and the positive transference deepened. At the same time, we were working on his need to separate more from his mother, of whom in real life he was seeing less and less, and he became aware of an anxiety about betraying her, were he ever to get involved with another woman and marry, something he very much wanted. For a while, this compulsive behaviour abated, and then it flared up, and he arrived one day in a panic, having been robbed of his expensive watch, his wallet, money and all his credit cards, in order to ward off being beaten up. Quite naturally, he became attacking, bitingly critical, and threatened to withdraw. The ideas conceived through our intercourse were stripped of their meaning, and it wasn't really clear whether I was the useless father or the mother whose food made him vomit. After we had survived that, something quite important and accidental happened. During an afternoon session, he was suddenly assailed by this pain in the stomach, of which he had told me. My head made me inquire about his activities the previous evening, but that led nowhere. Although I had just had lunch, I found myself suddenly feeling very hungry, so I casually wondered out loud if he was feeling hungry. His reply astonished me. He told me that he had no idea of what feeling hungry was really about. He often ate nothing for days on end, and when he did eat, the nature of the food was immaterial. It was usually a colleague or one of his musicians who would notice this lack of care for himself and persuade him to eat something. This interested me also from another angle, because he had formed the opinion that his pop groups related to him as if he was their mother. My perception had been different. He talked about his groups, record companies, the press, in a very ruthless way, and seemed oblivious of the exploitative nature of his relationships with them. This was an area where the vampire made its entrance. He went on to tell me that he had secretly thought that the pain in his stomach was a or the result of a residual injury sustained when he'd been kicked in the balls. In other words, he thought that the pain was really in his scrotum. We managed from this false connection to reach a deeper understanding of his cruising. Although physically he seemed unable to experience hunger, he was aware of an unspecified need. I began to notice three processes. Firstly, his anxiety, also unspecified, was related to the ratings of his groups on the charts. a drop in rating led absolutely predictably to a rise in cruising. Secondly, criticism, however mild, led to cruising and seemed to put him in touch unconsciously with early experiences of feeling humiliated, mainly by his mother. And thirdly, we began to see that he could not miss me. He simply felt I had gone, and would counter that momentary sensation with the excitement of his nocturnal vampire activities. As time went on, I was feeling more optimistic. His capacity to actually occupy and refurbish his house was mirrored in him feeling slightly more embodied, and in allowing his body to withstand the odd wave of feeling. He began to feel sexually aroused by women, and embarked on a relationship with a woman of independence. They began to sleep together happily, but then she was found to have mild cervical cancer, which he thought he had caused in fantasy. Reassured by her cure, he relaxed. They finally married and had a child. At the same time, one of his groups had been spectacularly successful in the States, and he started commuting. To contain himself during these absences, he kept a detailed diary of his internal world, and to some extent this worked. But he was picked up by the police for some sexual misdemeanor in the States, and became desperate at the thought that he may not be able to return. It was clear that there was a level of splitting we had not managed to get anywhere near. He wrote to me from America, "We have been doing too much travelling. Also, I've had a couple of disturbing earthquakes, which seem to upset one unconsciously. And also I've had a ridiculous problem with the police, which I'll tell you about when I see you. I've no idea where we should be living. The confusion of which country to settle in is reaching a kind of climax, and I just feel like a wandering Jew. Mind you, it's no longer a foregone conclusion that my visa will be renewed. Marriage is difficult for me and an effort, even though I love my wife. All in all, I'd like to be able to come and see you if you have time." I wrote back and got another note saying, "I miss our talks and feel sure that we had a few more years' work to do, but for that stability is needed. Eventually, stability inevitably will be re-established because it is not ideal to travel such distances." He finally decided to spend 6 months in the States and 6 months over here through the years, and so we worked towards termination. Splitting is a very conspicuous feature of Brian's mental processes. Its origin and the vicissitudes of its development in Brian remain unclear to me. The twins were not breastfed because the mother was afraid of her inability to ensure fair deals. Possibly at this stage, very early on, food and maternal care was split, feeding being stripped of love, not by innate envy, more probably by the ambivalence in the mother about mothering. Then the twins were split, each assigned to their own parent, and so on and so forth, right up to the termination of our work, where America had been identified as the safest supplier of narcissistic supplies, mother's world to some extent, and this country had all the drabness and ineffectuality of father's domain. But my original question was, what was the anxiety that made personalization impossible? The relationship with the mother is clearly central here, but I think personally that the father's ineffectuality is vital in trying to answer this question. His absence through the parental splitting constellated the mother as a bizarre person, making differentiation between self and object almost impossible because of the lack of healthy triangulation. The father's body is different from that of the mother, and so are the different parts of the body. Furthermore, this relates to an area often quite ignored in the literature. We're used to talking about the infant and the breast forming a thinking couple. We are not so used to thinking about the father as someone who creates a paternal environment that is both spacious and securely bounded. One of its constituents being to offer a commentary, like the Greek chorus in the dramas of the ancient Greeks, on the infant-mother duo, a sort of explanation of the behind-the-scenes going on to the audience, which consists primarily of the mother. This commentary is deeply affective, delivered with the naivety of an idiot, but also the conviction of the artist and the composer, who sees what is there to be seen and hears what is there to be heard. He is thus somebody and everybody, and holds the oscillation between being a body and anybody. To return to my schema, beginning with the depth dimension, nobody, I speculate that the mother was both nobody and no body, creating a void, where feeling and thinking should have combined to meet the deintegrating self. By nobody, I mean the absence in the deepest sense of an other, thus impeding the recognition of the other within the self. By no body, I mean the absence of an odorous, tactile, vibrant, sonorous, rhythmic, tasty, soft, cuddly, malleable, mobile, accommodating and rejecting body, which forms part of the mother's character. I think breasts are overemphasized. It's the totality of the mother's body and the interface between her body and that of her infant that is important. Blissful snugness or angular, meaningless disconnectedness. The result in Brian's case was a stuckness at an archetypal level, that of the transpersonal, the vampire, occasionally allowing odd sorties into the depersonal and the impersonal realms, in which a body, anybody, everybody were all hopelessly confused. The archetypal imagery associated with Brian's orality I have suggested is that of the vampire. In Slavic folklore, the vampire is a dead person of either sex who cannot rest in the grave, but rises by night to prey on and suck the blood of the living, the bite of the vampire turning the victim also into a vampire. Vampires can be repelled by crucifixes or garlic. They can be destroyed by being beheaded or pierced through the heart with a wooden stake. They can also be destroyed by sunlight, which we might think of as consciousness. Short Salence suggests that the vampire is the negative form of the spirit archetype, a psychic force that has no identity. It is, in a sense, the perfect shadow side of Narcissus, the psyche without a mirror. He sees it as a portrayal of the demonic inner state of despair. In Brian's case, I think this despair arose from his inability to think, as well as acute abandonment anxieties, which could not be contemplated. Driven and possessed by a transpersonal image, he was doomed to live for the most part in a depersonal or impersonal way, out of touch with his body, and dismembering and reifying other peoples. One of the essential tasks in the work seemed to me to help him become a little more embodied, by him introjecting my capacity to think about his body and his bodily needs and his emotions. Hillman writes, "Analysis pays particular attention to the body. It observes and listens to the body as experience. The body is the vessel in which the transformation takes place. Emotion always tears at the body, and light of consciousness requires the heat of emotion." I wish to end the question. Fordham maintains that the infant is a psychosomatic unity from the start, an original self, a system that spontaneously can divide itself up into parts. For that he coined the term de-integration. This hypothesis is very different from that of Winnicott, who in describing the infant's journey from absolute dependence to relative dependence mapped out three major achievements. Firstly, integration, followed by personalization, which is psychosomatic collusion, and then the beginnings of object relating. My question is, which theoretical framework would take us further in trying to understand Brian and the way in which his psychosomatic collusion was fractured or never achieved? Or can we best understand his behavior as a massive defense against the anxiety of disintegration or fragmentation of the self? Okay.